Hello, welcome to today's sports psychology revision screencast. The focus is going to be on attitude. So as you can see from the specification here, we need to do a few things really with regard to attitude. We need to be able to define it, as with all individual differences in sports psychology. On top of that, we have to have a look at the factors affecting attitude formation, so what allows us to form an attitude in the first place. Then once we've got one, we have to have an understanding of the three components which will underpin one attitude. Okay, so we have a look at the cognitive, affective, behavioural. On top of that, when you've got an attitude, of course, sometimes these attitudes can be negative. Therefore, it's really important that as people working in sport, as teachers, as coaches, we have an understanding how to change a negative attitude to a positive attitude, and these are the two strategies you can use for that. So if we get ourselves started then, definition of attitude, you've got here, so an unstable group of beliefs, feelings and actions towards an attitude object. So the key thing just to alert your attention to, you might want to annotate this, unstable. Now unstable, as we saw with personality, means it's unpredictable. Okay, so what this means is that attitude are these kind of beliefs, feelings that can change, okay, that they're changeable. So that is why you look at the strategies to change attitude, because you can change them. So that's why it's unstable. Beliefs will probably be enough towards an attitude object. So whatever the attitude object, whether it be swimming, whether it be fitness classes, people have an attitude towards that attitude object. So what we have to do then, first part, is having a look at this idea of how do attitude form. Okay, what are the origins of these attitudes we have towards certain attitude objects? So first one then, socialization. So socialization, and this basically links to this idea of your peers, of your friends. If your peers or friends do a behavior, it's more likely that you will follow that. Okay, so it might be that your peers or friends take part in sport, therefore you're more likely to take part in sport. If all of your peers, friends smoke, it might be that you're more likely to smoke. So try and link it to a sporting example here. So, I'll put one there. Okay, next one, past experiences. So past experience can really shape our attitude. I'll put an example there saying that, negative experience in PE lessons at school could actually lead to people choosing not to take part in sport throughout their life. On the flip side of that, if you have a real positive experience of PE at your school, that might lead to people having a lifelong participation in sport or physical activity. Religious beliefs, so certain religious beliefs make it more difficult to take part in sport. So for example, it's against Muslim religion for women to show skin in public places. So this will make it difficult to do activities such as swimming in a public swimming pool. Okay, so that would be an example you could use there. Media. Now, I'll put here as a benefit thing. I mean, one of the big focuses in kind of the media at the moment is this idea of mental health. So, for example, what you might do, your formation of the kind of benefits of physical activity in preventing depression could lead to a positive attitude towards taking part in physical activity. So, there's lots of examples of that. Obviously, it could be negative. So, for example, media could lead to a negative attitude towards sport. For example, not so long ago, there was a documentary on brain damage as a result of heading a football done by Alan Shearer, and you look at that and think, if a parent read that, that could lead to a negative attitude towards the sport of football due to the potential health implications. On top of that, final one, significant others or role models. So what we've got here then, if your significant other, or for example your parents, take part in physical activity, it's more likely that as a child you are going to do that. Okay, if your role models are people who are involved in physical activity, there is more chance that you will do physical activity. So that's an example there you could use. Now, if you're looking for something, if you did get a 5-mark question on attitude formation or the origins of attitude, if you just think of it like this, if you're looking at a way to remember these, you just go like this. You think, right, formation, okay, how were you formed? How is the human race formed? Okay, well, you might say it is formed by sperms. Okay, so if you go from there, don't think too deeply about that. So SPERMS, and that will translate into your 5 attitude factors or attitude formation factors that will allow you to answer those in the exam. I think it's more likely you're going to get 3 of those rather than 5. So just there, so you've got a safety net on ones you can use. So if we go on from there then, if this is how our attitude is formed due to the people we socialise with, due to kind of past experiences, once it's formed, what are the three underpinning components that form an attitude, okay, that create it, or, like, you know, to take up that attitude. So if we look at components of attitude, then it's depicted by something called the triadic model, a triangular model that has cognitive component of attitude at the top, affective at the bottom, and behavioral at the bottom here. So you've got those two, they are the components. Now what we have to be able to do to those components is describe them and link an example to them. And what I'm going to do is try and link the same example. So we're going to have an attitude object of running, okay, so taking part in running, and we're going to apply the three components of attitude to that attitude object. So if we start off then, cognitive. Now cognitive refers to the beliefs towards an attitude object. So if somebody took part in running, the beliefs or the information behind why they are doing running is because it is good for health, okay, so that would be a good thing for someone to use there. So running is good for my health, if running improves my fitness, okay, they are things that you could use as an example there. The next part, so we have this belief towards it, which obviously is really important on why we're doing something or why we're not doing something. The next thing is the affective component of an attitude, and this refers to the emotions or the feelings behind or towards an attitude object. So, you know, it's all very well saying running's good for my health, but it's way more likely you're going to have a positive attitude towards it if you know, you enjoy it. So for example, I enjoy going running, I enjoy the feeling of the endorphins after I've ran. Okay, these are things that you could use there. On top of that, we have behavioural. Okay, so behavioural, this refers to the actions towards an attitude object, and of course this is talking about the response towards the attitude object. So in this case, I go running 3 times a week. That could be an example there, and how you're applying it. Give some actual I suppose, like a number of times that people are doing it a week. It really just makes sure that you are getting the credit in the exam for the application to example. So that's something to have a look at. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Now obviously, if you're looking at things to remember this, I mean, you could just put in here for the 3 components of attitude, components, you know that components of attitude, this has to be in the exam question, nothing else. There's no trick. They cannot trick you on this. They're looking for the components of attitude. As soon as you see components of attitude, you should be okay with the fact that components and attitude are CA, and that helps you get to the kind of 3-point kind of acronym, I suppose, for this. So you've got CAB as the acronym, cognitive, affective, behavioural. Your job is to make sure that you describe those effectively. Now, another term that comes alongside this, which unlikely to be in the exam, it could never ask you about it, but it looks good if you know it, is when all 3 components of attitude agree. In this case, they are positive. You have a positive attitude towards running. Obviously that isn't always the case, but if you do have all 3 agreeing, okay, this has a name, and this is called consonance. Okay, so in this case you have positive consonance because all 3 components of attitude agree towards a positive direction towards an attitude object. Okay, so that's all the good side of it. That's when attitudes are good. But we all know that not everyone likes running. Not everyone likes everything. Therefore, when we have a negative attitude, it's absolutely vital that we have an understanding of how we can change that attitude. So if we have a look at this then, you've got here negative consonants. Okay, so this is the opposite now. So we're looking at, we'll keep running as our concrete example, and we'll have a look at specifically how this might be structured. So cognitive, beliefs towards an attitude object, running causes injuries, affective, emotions, feeling that I don't enjoy it, I hate running, behavioural, actions towards an attitude, I refuse to go running, I don't go running at all. Now, if that's the case, we now have negative consonants, therefore we need to try and consider how we would change that attitude, and there's 2 key strategies we're going to have a look at. First one, it's called cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is extremely important, and as you see, you've got a kind of this idea of cognitive in here, which, you know, I think can form. I mean, if you mention cognitive component in your answer for this, it's really good. But before we do that, we have to have an understanding of the direct translation of what cognitive dissonance is. So, what I tend to do here is to make sure when we're saying what it is, what is it, we then need to have a look at this C and the D from cognitive dissonance. Again, this is the content qualifier, so it's got to be in the exam question if they want it. And if it is, we use the first 2 letters here just to give us a nice, easy descriptor on what cognitive dissonance is, because it is the process of creating disharmony between the components of attitude we've just seen. So the triadic model, cognitive, affective, behavioural, if they are all negative, as we just saw there, towards running, we have to try and create disharmony, we have to try and create disruption, we have to try and create conflict between those components. If they're all negative, we've got to try and change 1, 2, hopefully 3 components of attitude so we can regain confidence in the opposite direction and start to change behaviour. So if that makes sense, that's the first section there. Now what we have to do then, so if I've told you what cognitive dissonance is, now what we have to do is, how do we do it then? Well, this is where this bit comes in. So if we could start to change people's beliefs towards an attitude object, it gives us a really good chance of changing the other components of attitude. So if we have a look at this one, the first one there, so how is the first step? Now it doesn't have to be in this order, there is no direct link to cognitive, but I think it really does help. If you can change someone's beliefs, you've got a good chance of changing the rest. So change the cognitive component. For example, rather than kind of saying that running causes injuries, a counter to this might be a GP for someone who is kind of overweight, for example, or a risk for coronary heart disease. But said running can help prevent coronary heart disease. Now you will know as PE students that the science behind that, but this would be enough for now. It could help prevent CHD. Now, as a result of that, it might mean that, the person who starts running starts to enjoy it. So the affective is changed. For example, I start to enjoy running due to endorphins being released. Finally, behavioural. For example, I now go running 3 times a week. Okay, so what we have then is a change of this. Okay, so we've changed these. And sometimes it can be that you've changed the cognitive and the behavioural. You don't always enjoy it, but because you know that running prevents CHD and you're at risk of getting CHD and you do running 3 times a week, that's 2 changed, and then you're starting to kind of reform an attitude. And the idea behind it is when you change 2 or more, certainly starting with cognitive in this case, this would then cause a drive to remove the disharmony, the kind of conflict, okay, and then we start to have this idea of regaining consonance. Okay, so now we regain consonance, and the idea in a perfect world is that we start to enjoy it, and all 3 of these are consonant. Okay, they have consonance, sorry, in a positive direction, and therefore everything's fine and dandy. Now I'm sure you can realize that that's not always the case, but you can, by changing 2 of them, that can really give you an idea of how people change their behaviors when needed. So that's one strategy, cognitive dissonance. Now what we need to think of is this idea, okay, if that's cognitive dissonance, there is another strategy that's really important that we understand. In the exam, it will be asked separately, but realistically, these kind of 2 work together. They're not mutually exclusive. So we have a look at this next one, and it's called persuasive communication. So persuasive communication is having to persuade someone to change, often by doing this stuff here in cognitive dissonance, but we have to be able to give at least a 3-point response for how we make the ability to persuade someone to change their attitude effective. So what are the factors that affect persuasive communication? Well, the key factors, first of all, is we need to think of in terms of how we're going to attack this. And when we do it, we need to consider 3 key questions that will allow us to answer give a good response, I suppose. So we need to consider, if you're trying to persuade someone to change their attitude, who is most likely to persuade? When they're doing it, what does the message need to communicate? What does the message need to be? Secondly, who receives it? Okay, and what does the person who receives it need to have within them? What do they need to be open to? And that would be our key things to go from there. So let's have a look then. First one, if you're using persuasive communication, it is most effective if the significant other or a role model is the person who's doing persuasive communication. So for example, a parent or a coach, for example, persuading a player to go training. A coach example here linked to training. On top of that, they need to provide a relevant message. It needs to have meaning to the individual who's trying to change their attitude. So for example, somebody who's gone to a GP who's obese and they're trying to lose weight. Okay, if the relevant message is, well, going to a spin class will lead to calories being burnt, which will help you lose weight. That is relevant to the person who is trying to lose weight because they're desperate to lose. It could be a PT, for example, who is giving this message. Okay, and then from there, The final thing, of course, is that the recipient, the person receiving the message, must have a desire to change the attitude. So, somebody who is, I don't know, in despair, desperate to lose weight, they're in a bad way, okay, they are open to changing their attitude. Therefore, they might be more likely to want to change. So that's an example you could use for that. Really important that when you answer these questions, you have an example that is linked to each point. Okay, I'm pretty sure, when you get these, you're going to get example-based command words. Okay, so describe, link to, example. So make sure you can do that. I've tried to make that very clear in here with a green pen. Okay, so if that is your kind of end bit, what I'd like you to have a quick look at now then is have a quick quiz check on this. So if I just give you now the 6 questions just to see what you've took in from this, could I ask you to pause it now and then have a go at just scribbling down what you think the answers are, preferably without using your notes, and see how you feel with those. Okay, right, so answers are these. I'll let you have a look at this. Okay, so I'm not going to go through those now, so you can have a look through your answers and pause it again if you just want to mark those. Okay, so let's have a quick look at some exam questions then. So the type of exam question here, now I've got to say this is a specimen paper. Specimen paper translates into usually pretty poorly worded. So with this one now, explain how attitudes to performing physical activity might be formed. Now you've got your key content qualifier here to attitudes and formed, okay, and explain is this one. So it's got performing physical activity. If it was an exam question in the summer series, in a formal exam, they would have to say using examples. Okay, so using examples explain how attitudes may be formed. This doesn't say that, which makes it quite confusing. So what I'd ask you to do is you should say formed. How are the human race formed? That would allow you to put down an acronym into here. Then your aim is to try and give examples linked to physical activity and just practice doing the right thing, even though this question isn't formed very well. So I'll ask you to pause it now, and you'll have an exam mark scheme coming up straight after. Okay, right, so that's the mark scheme there. As you can see, they've asked for maximum 2 marks for AO1, maximum 3 marks to be awarded for AO2. So what I would say here, so like I said, this is pretty poor. I'm pretty sure that you probably get a 3-mark question that would require AO1 and AO2 to get the marks. So describing it and exampling it, but it's good practice just to see the stuff in here. If you want to add, for example, education, to put that onto there, you could absolutely do that if you want to add some additional things on top. Okay, so let's move on from there then. Next question. So this one's looking here then using an example from sport. Describe the 3 components of attitude. So key thing here, components of attitude is your content qualifier. So can you remember the way you were going to use to remember that? Okay, put it down the side here. I think really important, I've highlighted this in yellow because it says using an example from sport. Now, this means this is singular. So when it says this, it means you have to use the same concrete example and you dissect it. So we used the example of running. Your job is to make sure you do that. So can I ask you to pause that now and have a go at responding to that question. Okay, so if you can see onto here then, what I've done is highlighted the kind of the components and the description, and I've left you to put your own examples in here, but you must make sure that you have those examples in. I've also highlighted this section here due to the fact that it says here must be the same throughout the answers and apply to the different components. So if you put separate sport and examples there, you would not get the marks. So just keep an eye on that example command word. Final one then, if we have a look at this, linked to this, so you'll be looking at attitude change. So you're looking at here then, it says here, explain the term cognitive dissonance in relation to a change in attitudes in sport. Cognitive dissonance then, so explain the term. So what you need to do now, it says change in attitude in sport, so you'd probably try and give it some link. Remember, we've got the C, D, and then you would have to give one way how they would do that to try and make sure you get your answer in. Persuasive communication then says using practical examples from sport. Okay, you can see the difference between these. These are questions from the 2018 A-level exams. You can see the difference in the question. Using practical examples from sport, explain 3 factors which influence the effectiveness of persuasive communication in changing attitudes. Keep that right. So think now, can you remember the key triggers that you would be asking yourself here and expanding that into an explanation and an example? Okay, so if you want to pause now, have a go. Okay, so I'll put in here, I've just kind of showed you the bits linked to the screencast, so if you want to have a pause and look through this now, hopefully people can see how they would respond to that and get the marks. Really important to have a look at this stuff here. From there, then that would allow you to get marks for it. Okay, so there's the screencast. You know, keep listening to it, have a look at it. Hopefully all areas make you feel pretty comfortable on that section. Okay, thank you.